Nakashima Brock, and welcome to this webinar on moral injury in humanitarian aid workers. I'm going to give us a couple of minutes for people to arrive. It's pretty early on the East Coast in the United States, so people may just be arriving in their offices or at their work sites. And I'm sure people from other places, which may make this time a little bit odd for them, if this is a global community of workers. I just want to say how grateful I am to be with you. I'm Rita Nakashima Brock. I am a Senior Vice President and Director of the Shea Moral Injury Center at Volunteers of America here in Alexandria, Virginia, which is where I am located today. Formerly land occupied by the Doeg people. I'm going to be briefing you on moral injury, which is a subject I have been researching and studying now for almost 15 years. I got interested in it back in 2008 or 9 as related to military veterans. I'm from a military family myself, and my stepfather fought in Normandy in World War II and did 2 tours in the Vietnam War as a medic. So I have some personal experience also with moral injury in a close family member, which is a personal interest of mine in the topic. So I'm going to begin and share a PowerPoint and go through this with you. I'm going to pause at the end of part of it so that you can catch up with things that may go by sort of fast and you have questions about things. So I'm going to give you a chance to react to part of the presentation, and then I'll move, and that will be the part that is an explanation of what moral injury is. And then the second half will be, what are some of the strategies to help alleviate it and help people recover? I'm going to start now. So these are, as I said, the things I'm going to say are beginning with definitions and understanding, including my starting assumptions that I've come to in doing this work, some of the definitions, and there are a number of definitions for moral injury, its impact on human beings. And if we have time, I'm going to see how we are with time, but there are religious and spiritual terms for moral injury. And those may be important, especially in global work, because there's so many diverse religions and communities, and understanding something about how they're talking about their experience may give you a clue that people may be experiencing moral injury, even though they don't know the term. And then some strategies for recovery, and how can you tell if people are recovering? So some of my assumptions are that people are born moral. And I think that's because we're hardwired neurologically, both for fear and love. And it turns out if you can't feel fear, you also can't feel love. And we maintain our lives. We need relationships of connection and love from the moment we're born. How we maintain that is by being what can be called being good, being a person worthy of that love. And so that is an inescapable human condition. And it's also the reason that moral injury occurs in people, because reality is huge and vast and often unsafe and chaotic. And so how human beings manage that vast reality is we access it, our meaning systems. And those are things we inherit from around us, our communities, and the places and cultures in which we live. And they differ quite a lot, but they all have a set of moral values that come with them. And so moral injury is actually an ancient phenomenon in religion. Most religions have some way of addressing moral injury, but it is new in psychology. It's gotten a lot of clinical attention and research being done on especially military veterans, which is where the concept first emerged in 1994. So another assumption that I'm working with is that moral injury is an ordinary human experience. It is not some sort of pathology that some people have that needs therapy, but rather it is, if you're a moral human being, you are going to be susceptible to moral injury. And people, I think, who do service work, who are idealistic and want to help others, may be even more susceptible to it. So moral injury is often confused with, because it occurs with PTSD, but it's not the same thing, and I'll explain why. And also that moral injury can have many different kinds of causes, but I suspect the human feelings are universal, that we share similar feelings that come with moral injury. So let me begin with the definition. Moral injury is a kind of moral conflict, that an inner conflict, an emotional conflict that is a conscience-based post-harm stress response. And I want to distinguish between levels of severity in moral conflict so that I can place moral injury in on that continuum. So the first level of moral conflict is just a discomfort we might feel because of something that happened to us or something we did, that we have to think about maybe and resolve it in some way by apologizing, forgiving. Moral discomfort is actually crucial to maintaining healthy relationships. And so people can feel it fairly often, and maybe even lose a night's sleep over it and be a little bit disturbed. So it's a discomfort that has a moral content to it. Moral distress is a level of severity beyond moral discomfort, where the moral conflict that one is feeling begins to interfere with your daily functioning. It may cause you a long period of sleep deprivation because you keep losing sleep over it. You may find yourself avoiding people, or there's just some, or you're feeling doubts about yourself. So moral distress has been especially used in healthcare around what happens to nurses. And I think the first article I found on moral distress in nursing was back from like 2011, but it's been around for a while. And then moral injury is the term that emerged in 2009 in a big way, in an essay that the Veterans Affairs clinicians published. And it is a deep kind of anguish, a profound suffering that threatens a person's identity, their core sense of who they are, their ability to trust other people and themselves, their relationships and meaning systems, and even their lives. It can be a factor in suicide. So these are the two prevailing definitions that emerged as the work developed with veterans. And Jonathan Shea in 1994 published a book called Achilles in Vietnam, based on his work with Vietnam era war veterans, combat veterans. And he defined moral injury as a betrayal of what's right. And by what's right, he means core fundamental moral values by someone who holds legitimate authority. So a leader, a decision maker, a government, legislators, an officer, or even the person themselves, someone who has the power to violate what's right in a high stakes situation. All three have to be present. What he's doing here is defining the conditions that create moral injury, but he doesn't actually say who might be affected by this definition in terms of who is feeling the moral injury, who is experiencing the moral injury. So it might be the person who did the betrayal. It might be the person who was betrayed. It might be a group, a team, a whole community of people who feel betrayed by a system. But the high stakes is important because it means that there's some kind of violence or harm involved. The team of clinicians, Jonathan Shea was a psychiatrist with the Veterans Affairs. So another team of mental health professionals in 2009, led by Brett Litz at Boston University, wrote an essay because they were seeing that even though they had excellent treatments for PTSD that worked really well and got better and better, the suicide rates in veterans kept climbing. And they realized that something was off about all of this, that the treatment should be helping that. And so they talked to each other about what they were seeing in their clinical practice in therapy. And they concluded that the thing that was missing in what they were doing was they were not addressing something they called moral injury, which is also a term that Jonathan Shea used in 1994. But this is the essay that sort of launched a huge amount of research about moral injury, both from the people who wrote the essay and other people who read that essay. And they define moral injury as a syndrome of shame, self-handicapping, anger, and demoralization that occurs when deeply held beliefs and expectations about moral and ethical conduct are transgressed. It can arise from killing, perpetration of violence, witnessing depraved behavior, or failing to prevent serious unethical acts. And it also includes betrayal of trust in leaders. I paraphrased that definition from a book they wrote in 2016 that elaborated on the 2009 essay. I think it's important to note the terms moral and ethical conduct here, because often moral means what we as individuals experience around what is right and good. And ethical has more of a larger sense of a collective. So we talk about business ethics or professional ethics. And so there's a suggestion there that it's not just an individual problem, but the ethical conduct has a larger framework in which moral injury occurs and can affect people. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because moral injury is a relational concept. It's a breakdown in your relationship, not only to yourself, but the world around you. So this is one of the few essays I could actually find on moral injury in humanitarian workers. And there's been a lot of moral injury research the last 2 years on all kinds of populations, especially first responders and healthcare, and other sectors that were deeply affected by the pandemic. But this essay says operational stresses associated with delivering humanitarian aid can be dramatic, and the resulting problems involving staff mental health are seldom clear-cut. Their work's physical consequences can be dangerous, but the constant ethical and moral qualities that confront them, quandaries that confront them, are often cumulative. No matter how hard humanitarian workers try to handle it, constant exposure to death, starvation, and mayhem affect their belief in justice and human rights. Every personal and professional value they hold is under assault. As Romeo Dallaire writes, it is the moral injuries that ravage our minds, our souls, and repeatedly assaults our most sacred and fundamental values and beliefs. In another essay on moral injury in first responders, and it makes a case that humanitarian aid workers are a kind of first responder. They outlined a scale that is been used to measure exposure to moral injury incidents. So in other words, this is not a diagnostic tool that will tell you if someone has moral injury or not, but it indicates that they may have been exposed to events and circumstances that might provoke moral injury. And so this is used sometimes to sort of say, we've got something here we need to handle that might be morally injurious. And so they're sort of, I'm not going to read the whole list to you, but they have to do with, I saw things that were morally wrong, and then I'm troubled by having witnessed others' immorals act. I acted in ways that violated my own moral codes, and I am troubled by having acted in ways that violated my moral values and code. So what they're looking at is, you may have been exposed to something, but it isn't necessarily troubling to you. And people handle how they violate their own moral codes in different ways. So some people may not have moral injury from the same incident that someone else may have moral injury from. So this code sort of tries to nuance some of those differences and to measure, okay, how many people said they were troubled by these sorts of things. And they include not only violating your own codes, but being a witness or even having survived a terrible incident that creates a kind of survivor guilt. So those are all, this is just a scale, and I will make this PowerPoint available after this as a PDF, so you don't have to be taking notes or worrying about remembering all these things. And we are recording this as well. So here is a diagram created by psychiatrist William Nash, who was a Navy psychiatrist for 30 years and is a combat veteran himself, and also is a psychiatrist now for Veterans Affairs here in the United States. He's actually, this is another interesting fact about Bill Nash, he's about to move to working with the UN in their refugee programs to work on moral injury. He's an expert on moral injury. So these are all the dimensions. This little pie chart sort of captures a whole person and the dimensions of that person that are affected by moral injury. And the first is emotional repertoire, because the kinds of feelings that come with moral injury, shame, guilt, anger, contempt, loss of honor, loss of joy, interfere with the full range of emotional repertoire a person may have that, and deny them positive feelings. And then there are their relationships that are affected by their inability to trust, their sense that they may be contaminating of other people, that they're unforgivable. So they lose connection to the most important relationships in their lives. They may have developed a self-concept. In other words, their sense of identity, their who am I, that question, their self-concept changes, and they may feel that they're no longer able to be good, that they can't be trusted, that they are a failure or hopeless. And that means that identity breach is also a disruption that reflects a disruption in their meaning system, how they organize their relationship to reality so they are resilient and can function in reality. So they may conclude that there's no God, that no one is good, that life has no meaning, or life has no purpose. And meaning and purpose are crucial parts of a meaning system, especially for people who go into serving other people, like humanitarian aid or healthcare, those kinds of professions, first responders. So another area of the self, that is one's capacity to manage one's behavior and relate to the world in ways that you want to relate to the world, that begins to break down. People have trouble calming down if they're in a state of anger at betrayal or in some way angry, morally angry. They may lose their sense of self-control, then become impulsive, have outbursts, even be toxically angry, just hair trigger anger, or go completely flat and have hardly any affect at all, and be emotionally unavailable. And this is an important dimension with moral injury that makes it difficult in many ways to get your arms around and say, well, if this happens, and then they got moral injury from this event, and it happens right there. Moral injury can actually take years to manifest. It can, because it's based on moral thinking, on moral judgments. Moral is the key term here. So a person may try not to think about those things and stuff the feelings involved with thinking about those things to try to avoid them. And avoidance behaviors may include using drugs or alcohol to numb the emotional pain, overworking, just maintaining a very, very busy life in order not to think about those things, or just other avoidance mechanisms. So when the moral injury hits, isn't predictable and can be unstable. So a person may have something remind them of a morally injurious event and then begin to mull it and have these deep emotions that are problematic and anguishing, and sort of work through it And then another time that same memory may come back and they are looking at it again. And so it has a kind of unpredictability sometimes where people may be functioning sort of looking like they're okay, but and then something will break that and they will suddenly find themselves at wit's end. So I actually know an Air Force veteran who actually flew a B-52 bomber during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so he was flying around for an entire month with his bomber fully loaded with nuclear material, and his target was Russia. And so for a month, he was ready to launch a nuclear war if called upon by the US government to do so. But he didn't have to. And so for 40 years, he didn't think about that experience. And then when he got ill and thought he was going to die, it completely flooded him. And he was in a deep moral pit about who he was as a 23-year-old who was willing to do something that evil. It took him a long time to get there. He carried that for a very long time. So what is the difference between moral injury and what is commonly called PTSD and trauma? So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is in the US Diagnostic Manual, which is the manual that enables mental health professionals to diagnose and treat a mental illness. So it is on the list of things that can be treated, and it's defined as a fear, anxiety-based disorder because what happens is your brain fear system is terrorized and it goes into high alert, but it's so activated that it has trouble calming down. It can't quite get back to baseline calmness. And so PTSD can vary a lot in severity and linger for various periods of time, but it comes in the aftermath of a terrorizing experience. And the symptoms can include hypervigilance, just you're constantly on alert and thinking you're in a fearful situation when you're not. You can be startled by things that don't bother anyone else. You may have something that is a triggering event, that something triggers in your brain the same stimulus, and you can have a kind of dissociative episode or flashback where you feel everything all over again. You may develop phobias. There's a loss of memory often associated with PTSD because your fear system shuts down your memory system when you're terrified. It isn't that you don't remember what happens, but it's not a conscious memory because your conscious memory system isn't operating. And so actually one of the treatments for PTSD is to try to help people get a coherent memory rather than those sort of bits and pieces that are dissociative episodes. That is PTSD, and trauma is connected to PTSD because it's an emotional response, and not just your brain fear system, but also an emotional response to a harmful event that creates sort of shock or even denial about it if it's so awful. And so later responses, if you're carrying trauma, can include the fact that the emotions of that trauma direct your response to reality. So you have emotionally often inappropriate responses to things, and that can be unpredictable and hard to control. Trauma may also include PTSD, so you may also have flashbacks and fear, and trauma will strain relationships and even result in physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. And long-term trauma can affect your longevity and your overall health for the rest of your life if trauma isn't handled. So moral injury is related to those two and can be what therapists call comorbid or co-occurring. But moral injury is not fear-based, and that's an important distinction with PTSD. It is loaded with traumatic feelings, but those don't come from terror. They come from moral conscience. So the feelings associated with moral injury that are not fear-based include guilt, shame, outrage, betrayal, a sense of betrayal, grief, remorse, humiliation, frustration, and despair. It can also lead to cynicism, hatred, a desire for vengeance. These are all not fear-based. And so moral injury, that's what moral injury is those moral emotions that are so devastating to our sense of who we are and our relationships. So moral injury is an emotional anguish associated with an unreconcilable moral or ethical conflict. And that term unreconcilable is important because it's a sense that you can't recover your sense of who you are and your previous moral system because it fell apart for you, and something fell apart for you. You can't integrate what happened. It's just overwhelming to you. In Shea and Litt's definition, the focus is really on the individual actors and how to help them recover from moral injury. But it's also true, and Shea's definition of it especially points to this, that you can be inside an unjust system, that where the system operates by a kind of collective acquiescence with hierarchies of authority that aren't caused by individual, so that moral injury may not be caused by an individual actor violating a moral code, but the whole system itself may be hurting people. So the system could be social, political, spiritual, religious, but they inflict injustice, lies and deception, violence, or inhumanity on people. So they operate beyond individual actors. They can be economic, gender, race, military. Internationally, there are all kinds of different systems that might be regarded as unjust, and people can experience moral injury from those unjust systems. So moral injury affects teams and communities. It's not, even when it's an individual who's experiencing moral injury, if that individual is on a team, then that team will be affected by their suffering moral injury, even if no one else on the team is suffering moral injury. It will affect the whole team. It affects families. So certainly my family was directly impacted by the moral injury my father brought back from Vietnam. So it's disruptive of collectives because it disrupts the shared meaning system that grounds the relationships of that collective and sustains ethical relationships in that collective. It can shatter trust and our ability to justify, understand, process, and integrate memories into a coherent self. So that's the identity crisis piece. It is not reversible. And that's why it is important to understand that the meaning system that failed has to be examined, and whatever is salvageable is salvaged, but a new meaning system has to be constructed. And that takes a long time, and it takes people around you. You can't just invent your own meaning system that's not connected to other people. And so it's a long process of recovery. It's not simple. It can even be transmitted intergenerationally. People can re-traumatize successive generations, not even intending to do so. Mariana Hirsch has studied this intergenerational problem in the literature of children whose parents were in the Holocaust, which is also her life circumstance. And she calls that intergenerational transmission of trauma post-memory. And what happens is that people in the generation that didn't experience the horror or the terror and may feel as if their own lives are sort of trivial or unimportant in relation to a previous generation. And they may actually sort of be consumed or overrun by the previous trauma. So their whole lives are swallowed up in resolving the trauma themselves. And that is different from historical memory, in which you may empathetically feel other people's trauma, but you understand it's not your own. And you may even want to fix the world in a way that then never happens again, but you don't carry that trauma in your body system in a way that affects you the way it can when it's lived trauma. And so while it's off, moral injury is often confused with PTSD. And so it's often seen as a mental health issue. I don't think of it that way, so I don't talk about it that way. I don't think it's in conflict with mental health treatment. I think, in fact, it's a value added, or it's a necessary piece, but it isn't a mental health issue. So there was a study actually done in 2018 at in Minnesota, in which a clinician took two groups of military veterans who had diagnoses of PTSD, and they were being treated at the clinic for PTSD. And she took half of that group and had them go through a parallel group therapy process. And then she took the other half of those veterans and had them meet with a chaplain in groups 2 hours a week for 8 weeks. And in the chaplain group, they grappled with meaning questions. They grappled with questions of God and evil. They grappled with questions about reconciliation and identity. And at the end of that process, in comparing the PTSD treatment outcomes for both groups, it was clear that the group that went through the chaplain program had better outcomes for their mental health treatment. So addressing moral injury is important, actually, for better outcomes for mental health treatments, but it's not a mental health condition. You can have moral injury without any kind of mental health disorder, and you can have it without PTSD. So moral injury isn't the same thing, but it's very tightly locked in with how our mental health goes. And so this is a quote from an essay on humanitarian work and moral injury. And this quote is that the humanitarian organization's commitment to staff psychological well-being cannot function as a separate tool only used when a staff member suffers an emergency. That sentence is important because you can have moral injury without having had an emergency. For example, this is an example used with law enforcement. Say you are a law enforcement officer and you have been called to get to some place because there's something coming that could be prevented. And for some reason, whether it's your own fault or it's traffic or something, you are delayed a little bit in getting there as fast as possible. And by the time you get there, a disastrous situation has already unfolded, and you come in at the aftermath of a terrible event. You weren't involved in the emergency, you just were to get there, but you may start to feel terrible, like guilty or ashamed that you didn't get there in time. So you may experience moral injury from that, but you didn't experience a terrorizing event or anything. You just experienced, and you wouldn't probably even be called in for an incident report because you didn't fire your weapon or anything, and you didn't actually do anything in the situation that was part of the situation. You just came back upon it as a witness. So that sense that having a sense of making sure people are okay is not just focused on people who experience emergencies or incidents. So mitigating mechanisms must be planned and proactive because the demands on all humanitarian staff, both national and international, continually change and reflect the extremes of the natural environment, threat levels, and vulnerable populations conditions. In this context, an aid agency's principal responsibility is a well-defined process for short and long-term staff support. These protocols ensure mental health is a required inclusion in operational planning and execution. I would add also moral injury, not just mental health, but moral injury. And Michael Yandel, who is an Iraq War veteran, defines moral injury. I think this is a sort of wonderful summation of it in relation to humanitarian values. He says moral injury is the demoralizing heartbreak of knowing justice, love, and goodness in their absence and despairing of life itself. So I'm going to pause there and see if you have reactions or thoughts or questions or observations about the understanding and definitions I've proposed here. And you can use the raise hand function or use chat. Oh, here's a wonderful comment. That's why in Islam, the right to life, the first and the foremost basic right is the right to live and respect human life. And it's a quote from the Quran. Whosoever kills a human being without any reason, like manslaughter or corruption on earth, it is as though he had killed all mankind. As far as the question of taking life in retaliation for murder or the question of punishment for spreading corruption on this earth is concerned, it can be decided only by a proper and competent court of law. If there is any war with any nation or country, it can be decided only by a properly established government. In any case, no human being has any right by himself to take human life in retaliation for causing mischief on this earth. Therefore, it is incumbent on every human being that under no circumstances should he be guilty of taking human life. If anyone has murdered a human being, it is as if he has slain the entire human race. These instructions have been repeated in the Holy Quran. Thank you for that. That is a common understanding that's shared, the sense of murder as a soul endangering act. That's true to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And the word for that is often translated as sin, but it's not ordinary sin. It's not moral discomfort sin where you do something wrong. It's something that actually endangers your very core soul. That's one way that monotheisms talk about murder, is that you're separated from God and your community, and you have to do something to do something in restitution, remorse. There's a whole ritual process, and religions tend to have that kind of a process. Let's see. It says that 2 people have raised hands. And I'm trying to find you. Okay, this looks like one. I can only see a phone number. It's so I'm gonna allow you to talk. The phone number is 1-202-733-8351. So I'm gonna allow you to talk. Oh, sorry, that was my mistake. You didn't have your hand raised. I'm trying to figure out this webinar system that we've got set up here. Because I cannot see who has for some reason, who has their hand raised, even though I'm the host. Perhaps if you could put your comment or question in the chat, that would help, since I can't seem to find the raised hands and allow you to talk. So do children, here's a great question, do children experience moral injury? Yes, they do. A woman named, a sociologist, a professor of social work named Wendy Haight at the University of Minnesota did a study of moral injury in youth who had been through foster care, fostered youth. And they reported all kinds of childhood experiences that caused moral injury in them as children. And she actually also interviewed them in terms of coping mechanisms they used and how they survived horrifying childhood experiences as fostered youth. And one of the clear things about moral injury in children is that having even one caring, loving adult in their life who's willing to listen to them, that they can trust, is really important for their recovery process. And that was a key factor. The essay that she's published, that she's submitted to a journal about that, I was a consultant on the project, but it hasn't yet been published. It's still under review because the journal is behind. I don't know why my hand is up, but I think I was looking for raised hands. Is survivor's guilt a type of moral injury? It absolutely is. I think it's a terrible feeling to, it's a feeling, especially people who work on teams or in relation to other people, and then they lose their whole team. They feel sometimes they lose their identity in that moral injury and may either kill themselves because they feel like they didn't deserve to survive, or they may only be staying alive as the sole survivor of a team because everyone else has died, and they feel obligated to make their lives mean something. And that's one outcome that can come from moral injury. The name of the sociologist that I mentioned is Wendy Haidt. So you can look for her, you can Google her name, and we have a resource at our VOA. I'm going to give you this link as well. At our website, we have a resources page. So when that essay comes out, it will get listed there. We also have a Facebook page if you want to join our Facebook page called Moral Injury, a community of practice, where we post weekly or more than weekly. There's so much coming out now. We post essays we think are helpful to people in all kinds of professions. That's the Facebook page, Moral Injury, a community of practice. Great. There's a question about wonderful questions. Can you type? Okay. I wonder, as aid workers, we experience a feeling of loss and frustration with not seeing our efforts make a difference, or for example, seeing things like the hatred and racism at home and not working on that issue at home. What would that be? I think that's a form of a moral distress, at least. I think if it starts to make you doubt your own work, or I think we've seen this happen right now in healthcare, where people have just given up on careers they've invested decades in. They just give up because they just feel like there's nothing they can do. And it turns out medical doctors have pretty high suicide rates. So that sense of frustration, not seeing, and I think that's happened during the pandemic. And it's also, seeing things, that conflict between missions, between wanting to do the work that you're committed your life to do, but also realizing that you have some responsibility for another situation, that is a moral conflict, and it can create distress. And I think moral distress, if it goes on long enough or accumulates, there are many moral distresses, a person can break. They can just start to wonder who they are and give up. So moral injury is the severest form of moral conflict and distress. I think there's no diagnosis for it. There's no, if you have these symptoms, you have moral injury. I think it's a sense that you no longer feel like yourself, or you see it in someone else because they've changed enough that you're worried about them. it's like they don't see themselves. That's often because they're struggling with a major moral quandary. You mentioned short and long-term programs to support humanitarian workers' mental health and moral injury are important. Do you have information or resources of how to build these? I think I'm going to get into that a little bit about recovery, but I think that one important dimension of support for staff is a chaplain. This is true in the military. And I don't actually know if USAID has chaplains, but in the military, a mental health professional is required to report a diagnosis to the commander of the unit because of security and endangerment of teams and things like that. But chaplains are not allowed to share what's happening in their counseling or support for troops. And so people in the military are more likely to seek support from a chaplain than they are a clinician partly for that reason. And it's also not particularly stigmatizing to seek spiritual guidance as opposed to seeking treatment for a mental health problem. So I think that chaplains are an important intervention strategy, both for mental and moral injury health. So a chaplain can address moral injury directly, and a well-trained chaplain can also recognize that somebody might need mental health support and recommend it, and try to make it safe and okay for that person to seek it. And if the person doesn't want to seek mental health support, the chaplain might have some tools to try to help support them. There's a project that a professor of medicine and theology at Vanderbilt and a clinician at Duke University in psychology have cooperated in co-training, as it were, training mental health workers about chaplaincy and moral injury, and training chaplains about some of the mental health work that clinicians do, so that they can work as teams together. And I think that that's actually the best way to do it. But I think a chaplain, especially an interfaith chaplain or a chaplain who has some sophistication about religious diversity, is very valuable in working with people with moral injury. And I think that study in Minneapolis with the chaplain group versus group therapy is telling in relation to moral injury, that chaplains, and I'm going to explain why a little bit more in that in the second half of my presentation. The next section is on remediation and recovery, what resources, models. So let me get to that. That seems to be the question that's on everybody's mind. That's part 2. Here we go. All right. And we will, here we go. So this is the relationship I've been talking about in relation to chaplains, or spiritual caregivers is another term for chaplains, and clinical professionals in relation to moral injury recovery. Why the clinical approach is limited in its capacity to address moral injury, and yet why addressing moral injury is really important in supporting clinical treatments. So the clinical model is medicalized. It's a transactional model in which you have an expert who has knowledge, a useful healing knowledge, and a person who's seeking healing. So you have to seek out clinical help. And then it's billed, and it's also transactional in the sense that it's not an equal mutual relationship. The person who's the expert is there not to share themselves, but to share their expertise in support of someone who needs it. And so the person who needs it is the person who makes themselves deeply emotionally vulnerable to the clinician in order to receive help. Whereas spiritual caregivers work in more community-based, often traditional models. It isn't necessarily that they're not required to work individually, although they can provide spiritual care and guidance individually. But they also are organizers of community-based traditional models. And in a lot of societies, the individualized, medicalized model isn't very helpful because their orientation is not toward the priority of the individual, as is in Western Christian culture especially, but rather a collective where the individual is subordinated to a collective. And so community-based spiritual caregiving might actually be more effective in different cultural contexts. So also the clinical model, it involves evaluation and diagnosis in order to treat, because there's the diagnosis and the protocol to treat. And so it's the job of a therapist to fix, to help, to make better. Whereas spiritual caregivers do a lot of just going alongside and supporting people and listening and just providing empathy and emotional care. They're not required to diagnose anything. They're not required to evaluate. They're required to be spiritual support. And that's different. And they don't charge by the hour for that. Chaplains are usually salaried rather than billing for hours. And that's different in the medicalized versus the spiritual caregiving model. And then there's the issue in clinical work of a certain kind of professionalized standard that has a boundary attached to it, which is that if you're a good clinician and the person you have been treating gets better and the treatment ends, the relationship ends. The person who's made themselves emotionally vulnerable is now no longer going to see that person again. And that can be really difficult, emotionally difficult, if one's had a really serious relationship with your therapist. A spiritual caregiver can maintain a kind of personal relationship, and spiritual caregiving also has professional ethics and standards attached, like you cannot sexually exploit that kind of relationship. And yet you can maintain a personal relationship with someone that you have counseled or supported as a spiritual caregiver. And in congregational or community life, those relationships may be ongoing for a lifelong period. And then the recovery process, when it ends, the relationship ends. And then, as I said, the continuing contact is possible for long periods of time, sort of as a mutual thing. By mutual agreement, they continue the relationship or end it. It's sort of optional that way. So clinical professionals and spiritual caregiver professionals have slightly different approaches to what they do. And so they can have overlap. There's certainly a lot of overlap. But clinical mental health and behavioral health people generally don't talk about prayer or existential issues like, why did God do this to me? Or who am I? And I can't tell who I am anymore. They don't do end of life rituals necessarily, and don't necessarily talk to people about things like miracles. But both have the capacities to listen, to be compassionate, to use silence, to help people take risks, to support people grieving and having difficult emotional responses to things. So I think this is the cooperative relationship between mental health professionals and spiritual professionals. And so here are some of the strategies that I think are helpful. Spiritual healers can use rituals. And rituals help implant values so that they become embedded in a person's psyche. It's not possible to do that intellectually. It really requires repetition and ritual. And so spiritual healers can use rituals. I have a friend whose sister is a chaplain in a hospital. She started a practice. This is not an uncommon practice. She started a practice in the hospital when a patient coded, which means a patient was at risk of dying. It's called a code blue, and the team rushes in to save them with all kinds of equipment or whatever is needed to help the person stay alive. And if the team fails to save the person, the doctor calls the death, then the team starts to dismantle the equipment and go on to the next code or put stuff away. And she actually tried to show up at the codes. And if the patient died, she asked the team to just pause for a minute. She asked them for just a minute of time. And she had them stand quietly and breathe. That sort of mindfulness breathing that calms all that adrenaline, stress hormones, or cortisol down in their bodies a little bit. So she had them do this sort of deep belly. The mindful breathing is when you draw your breath way down into your diaphragm, deep into your lungs, and hold it for a second or two. And then you release the breath at double the time as an exhale, as an inhale. So you breathe in for 4 and exhale for 8. The exhale is long and slow, and that's what calms the body down. She had them do this breathing, just a few of those breaths. And then she offered a sectarian sort of prayer. I mean, a non-sectarian, just a sort of generic prayer of comfort, hope for comfort to the family and to their well-being of the person who died, and gratitude. And then she offered gratitude for the team, for their commitment to trying to save that person's life, and for the gifts they brought to the situation, and for their own sense of loss about having a person die. And so it just took her a minute of time with the team before she then released them to do what they needed to do after the death. And they started calling her the Minute Chaplain, because that moment of holding the terrible thing that had just happened, rather than trying to run from it by jumping right back into working and everything, was actually helpful, because it calmed, number one, it calmed this huge adrenaline rush that they had experienced in trying to save the life. It calmed that down a little bit, so they could just kind of take in the feelings and do a little processing of them. And that little moment of processing is really helpful when people experience horrifying things like, or just devastating things like that. So when that's possible, it's really useful. There's also a woman who's a hospital chaplain who had really stressed staff in her hospital. And many of the chaplains I've worked with say that once COVID hit, their time with staff needing support from them more than doubled in time before the COVID hit. And so staff were also seeking support, chaplains, and help. And so she started doing 5-minute things in the break rooms with people that were simple rituals of using oil or having them do a small art project or something that just helped them focus on the moment in the room and sort of leave the chaos behind for just a moment to center themselves. And so she started doing that with staff, and that helped them as well. And then there are things longer. If you have time with people, there are longer things you can do over the course of an hour or 3 hours or even a day. I just returned last week from Baton Rouge, Louisiana here, where we have Volunteers of America staff in a really exhausted, burnout state, because they have assisted care centers for mentally disabled adults, for mental illness, and for aging populations. And so the supervisory managerial staff was in dire straits, because they had been covering weekends and night shifts, so their staff could get time off, but they were working days supervising and working these shifts. And so they were at risk of losing a lot of those staff. And so we had created an all-day moral injury processing program with peer facilitation. So the OA staff from other affiliates who are chaplains agreed to go and do peer facilitation. We train them to do the facilitation. We developed the program with them. And so we spent 2 days doing 11 people each day. And because we don't allow lines of reporting in these peer-led groups, the executive, the COO, the CEO, and the chief of chaplains met with me and a clinician that that always backs up the facilitation team. The two, they met with the clinician and me one-on-one to process their own moral injury. So you can do an all-day thing. Our moral injury processing program for military veterans that's in person that we haven't been able to run because of the pandemic, it takes 50 hours. This is for veterans who have recently been homeless or in some kind of substance misuse treatment program, or some of them were recently released from prison. So these are very high risk veterans who whose moral injury was profound enough to impact their lives deeply. So we do a program with them that takes 50 hours and it's evidence-based, and we've demonstrated it works. And we actually use things we learn from that program for the shorter ones we do. So there are lots of ways that you can create support for people who are experiencing moral distress. The shorter ones are really not, I mean, they're helpful, but they don't do what a 50-hour program could do with somebody who has a serious case of moral injury and whose identity and life are at risk. But they can support people to stay slightly more resilient. And then there are these secularized spiritual practices that come from different religious traditions like yoga, Tai Chi, mindfulness, contemplative prayer, labyrinth walking. These are spiritual practices that don't necessarily require you to adhere to the particular meaning system that they come from, but they actually involve the body and engage our physiology in ways that actually help us access morally injurious memories and begin to process them. So, and they aid in that processing by helping manage the emotional upset that those kind of experiences can create by calming the body, calming the person through the use of the body, lowering the cortisol. And we use these in our peer facilitated groups all the time. We use mindfulness breathing, especially because you can have someone sharing a really painful emotional experience and be almost unable to speak. And we suggest that they just have everybody, including the person who's trying to speak, just breathe a couple of times, and that often helps with that whole process. So we use these spiritual practices, but they're not attached to a belief system, and that's also very useful. And then we use visual art, creativity, partly because creating something actually helps you focus on the present. It actually feels good to create things, and a lot of trauma, a lot of traumatic, deeply traumatizing experiences and morally injurious experiences are not verbal. And so creating a visual memory, even a music, that these aesthetic experiences of creating something visual actually can access memories that aren't verbal, that can't be told out loud until they're actually visualized. So, and a clinician at working with military veterans with traumatic brain injury and PTSD started using a process of having them make masks because their verbal capacities weren't very good. Had them make masks, and that turned out to be an amazing revelation, because once they made a mask, they could describe what they were feeling. And we use that with our veterans. We have them make a mask of their moral injury face. So creating something. We also do other kinds of arts. It's just a magical thing because it's so integrative, creating something. And writing is another kind of art form or expressive form that we use a lot in our peer facilitated groups, where we have people free write, where they can't, you write for 10 minutes and don't stop, and people surprise themselves often by what they write when they can't stop writing. So they can't stop and think and censor, they just keep writing. So we use writing, we use art, we use also beauty and natural light are important for well-being, and natural light especially is crucial for sleep. There's a lot of research on sleep in relation to mental health and physical health. And the best thing anyone can do for all of their overall and spiritual health is get good sleep, and natural light is key to that. And beauty is just that kind of thing that can mesmerize you and hold you in the present in a way that helps your mood and your emotional state. So we try to, when we do in-person meetings, try to have some way to, if they're not allowed to be outside, to have some time for natural light and to create a space that's aesthetically beautiful for people to meet in. I think that's a powerful thing to do. And then, as I said, we use peer specialists a lot. We use chaplains as well. And sometimes chaplains are peers because they're working with other chaplains. But we find that the peer special approach has a number of advantages. For one thing, it creates the bar for trust is low, because if you're in a group, if you're a first responder or a humanitarian aid worker and you're in a group with other humanitarian aid workers and there's no authority in the room, there's no expert in the room, there's no one there to evaluate you, it's confidential, and you're there with people who get what you do and will understand and be less likely to judge you for things, that creates a lower bar for trust, and trust is essential for the process of healing. So that's important with peer specialist work. And in a peer specialist context, the peer specialist is someone who has experienced moral injury and processed it in the small group process themselves. And so they are able to make themselves vulnerable by sharing their own experiences with a group that can model what emotional vulnerability is possible in the group. And so that aids the sharing process for everyone in the group. And we tell our peer support specialists, if you have somebody that looks ready to share, let them share. But if people are silent and seem hesitant to share your own experience. That you're a peer. You're not there to be an expert. And the other thing in a peer specialist program is that the peer isn't there to adjudicate the truth of somebody's experience or evaluate it. They're just there to listen to it. And they're there to encourage others to listen and not judge. So the point of the process is to evoke empathy toward oneself by also evoking empathy for others in the group process. And what happens then as the group evolves in the sharing process is that people's horrifying and negative experiences, the worst things that ever happened to them, get shared. They get to release some of the emotional burden of those experiences. And then they discover that that experience can have value for others who can relate to it, who can offer empathy, who can see in the experience something positive in you, that you had courage or you were very perceptive to notice. There are all these things that happen when the sharing happens that make it valuable to share awful experiences. And that sharing is the first step to the processing that is the recovery from the moral injury. And that sharing also encourages a kind of strength-based sense of self-worth in that experience, because people will often affirm each other for things in those experiences that are strengths. And we even ask people to do that at the end of a process. Name one good thing, one positive thing, one thing you're grateful for. It also creates a circle of agency where everyone in the group is not only there to be vulnerable and share, but also to help each other. And that process of taking agency for help, taking agency for sharing your own story, of helping others, is the process of the recovering, because your moral conscience is your agent in this process, and it's been afflicting you. And so there's a way that you can begin to use that moral conscience agency to help. And then you begin to recover. And in a peer specialist facilitated group, no one needs to be there to fix or offer answers to anyone else. Sometimes that happens, but mostly it's the listening itself that is the, as it were, the fix. It starts the process of recovery. The other thing with peer specialist work is that it's easy to scale. Right now in the US, there's a massive shortage of mental health therapists available to help people who actually want to have the help, much less people who need it and don't think they need it. There's just not enough mental health specialists. So if you have peer specialist groups, anyone who goes through the process can be trained, if they want to become a facilitator, to become a facilitator. And what our facilitators always tell us is, I love facilitating because it really helps me, because sometimes I come into the group and I've had some experience this week that I can share with them, and it helps me, but it also just makes them feel great to see people come alive in those groups, to see them share things they deeply need to share and connect with each other. It's just really incredibly rewarding to facilitate a group like that. So it's easy to scale. And it's also a useful model to go alongside mental health treatment. So you're not using your mental health specialist to deal with moral injury, you're using your mental health specialist to really address the things that they need to work on, while, as in that chaplain program, while you have a parallel process going on moral injury that can help people also do better in their mental health treatment. And we've certainly seen that with our veterans. We've had people with mental health diagnoses that were sent by their clinician to go through our group that helped, because they saw the evidence in other veterans that had benefited from the program. So signs of recovery, how do you know if people are getting better? For one thing, they reconnect with relationships they may have separated themselves from, or they develop new and long-lasting relationships that are satisfying to them. They may return to communities or re-engage with communities, or become parts of new communities. So they return to wanting to connect to other people. So they're integrating, they're slowly beginning to integrate what happened to them and developing the self that can reconnect. It's not going to be the person they were before. You cannot forget what happened to you if you had moral injury, but you can figure out how that moral injury becomes a source of information rather than driving your life. It becomes something that's true about you that you've learned things from. That is what it means to integrate moral injury and to recover from it. The other thing is that people who begin to share their moral injury experiences, who actually can share them beyond a small confidential trust group, or even in writing about it, that retelling of the moral injury story is crucial to the processing. To tell it once is not enough because it's a complex experience. But the key to the recovery is that you will notice in yourself or in other people that the story keeps shifting. It's like you don't tell it the same way every time, because you see new things as you begin to process, and oh, I hadn't thought about that, or that's another angle on it, or, oh, I think I was wrong about that. That process is a good process. My friend Tyler Boudreau, who's a Marine Corps veteran from Iraq, says that, and he writes on moral injury, he has a doctorate in communications. He says that if a person tells their moral injury or their terrible experience story the same way every time, it doesn't vary, almost like a script, it means they're hiding. It means they're not processing. So variations are not because they lied and now they're telling the truth or any of those kinds of evaluations. It just means they're processing. And that is a good thing. And that processing enables them increasingly to begin to integrate that experience as a truth about their life that now informs it going forward rather than cursing it going forward. And through that process, the person begins to connect and to look forward, to have some joy, wonder, and curiosity about life, and hope. And that is really, really important for a sense of resilience. So resilience, the recovery process for moral injury is messy because life is messy, and you can be on what you think is a good road and then you have a setback. But I think if you have been processing, you'll never go back to the place you were when you started the recovery process. It's just something that's going to be with you the rest of your life. So integrating it slowly is a really important part of the process. So I'm going to stop there. That's my main PowerPoint, and I have a few more minutes, I think. Yeah, 15 minutes for some chat questions. Okay, here we go. Oh, great. People have posted resources. That's awesome. I'm glad I'm going to have this recording to look at. So let me go back to where we started before. Immediately after the verse of the Holy Quran, which has been mentioned in connection with right to life, God has said, and whosoever saves a life as it is, has saved all lives of mankind. This is a spiritual healer for Muslims. That's a great corollary to killing a person. One of the things I wanted to say in response to the idea of authorized war and killing versus murder is that in military veterans, where their killing is authorized, they're actually trained to do it well. And everyone carries the Geneva Codes in their breast pocket. That means that the codes say that you don't kill civilians, you only kill other combatants who are trying to kill you. It doesn't seem to be a huge difference in rates of moral injury, whether the killing was lawful or not. My friend Camila Mejia, who had a serious case of moral injury from the Iraq War, shot at someone with a grenade in his hand. But he had a thought just before he shot that something was gonna get messed up in his soul if he killed that person. And then he did, and immediately he had a moral injury response to it. And the studies of veterans who have killed in war are that they're about twice as likely to commit suicide as other veterans who already have an elevated suicide rate. So whether the killing was lawful or not, I think it may be that you got a medal. It may be that you were awarded something because you did a lawful killing that saved lives on your team or your own life. Even killing in those circumstances can create a morally injurious situation for people. So I think people differ in their ability to handle those things. And differ in their sense of ethics about it. And so some people will be able to distinguish between lawful and unlawful killing. I think one of the more famous cases from World War II was a famous German pacifist named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was in the US and safe, went home to Germany as the Third Reich arose because he was from an influential family. So as a pacifist, he got involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler. And the plot almost succeeded, but he was executed for being in that plot. And people have always puzzled about how, as a pacifist, he could have been involved in a killing plot. And he never, he got killed, so we don't have a way to ask him. But some people who have speculated that he was willing to risk his own moral injury because not doing what he wanted to do, not trying to kill Hitler, to him was a greater evil than killing him. And so how people come to terms ethically with things that they do is very complicated. So that's, but saving a life, this is another problem with even with saving a life, is that sometimes even saving a life can make people feel terrible because they didn't save enough lives, or they just feel like the context was so awful. I mean, so even if the saving a life may be a positive in a terrible situation, but it can also make you feel like a failure because you didn't do enough to save everyone else. So it gets very complicated how people's consciences think about these things. There's some literature on how people hold trauma and moral injury physically in their bodies, and therefore there must be physical ways of releasing that. Tapping is one approach I've heard about. Thoughts. One of the treatments for trauma is eye movement therapy. There's something about having people move their eyes back and forth slowly that can release memories. And a psychiatrist actually discovered this on her own, walking through a park when her eyes were going back and forth. And then suddenly she had these things happen to her and she thought, oh my gosh, this is really helpful to me. And so it's now a standard kind of treatment that's used to help people with trauma memories. That's one. And then there's a process called trauma release exercise that uses body tremoring to help people access what may be held in some part of their body that's holding the trauma. Because of course, a lot of trauma is physical and that part of your body may be affected. So yes, we are a mind-body entity. There's not something that's a body and a mind. Our brains are part of our whole signaling system. Whether there's something called spirit outside of the mind-body continuum is different based on the perspective meaning system that you hold to. But there's certainly lots and lots of traditions that have presences that exist that are outside physical bodies. So that's just a side note about what spirit might mean in different traditions. And I published a piece on applicability of mindfulness, breathing, and yoga for resilience, active duty, and veterans. Thank you for that resource. It's really, those practices involve the body and our spiritual practices. So they actually do help. And another one on, let's see, that's the publication on yoga. Somatic experiencing as a trauma intervention. Yep, it's very highly effective to use those kinds of things. Anyone with questions about how to implement some of these supportive resources within their own team should feel free to reach out to staff care. We can offer guidance and support. That's great to know. Thank you. Okay, those are so far the chat comments. And I have a little time. I wanted to say something about the religious dimension of moral injury, which takes a long time, but I have a whole different lecture on how religions talk about moral injury because they don't use the term. But as I said, Judaism, Christianity, Islam talk about sin. And in Hebrew, for Judaism, avon is a kind of sin that's idolatry or murder. It's a huge kind of sin. And then they have other kinds of sins that aren't so big, but avon means that kind of major sin. In Catholicism, mortal sin is that kind of sin. And I think in Islam, major sin might be a way to indicate that kind of sin. And that's what I think moral injury is about, is that kind of sin. In Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, those religions that come out of Asian subcontinent, South Asia, and have spread across much of Asia and now into the other places also. That their traditions are not what we would call monotheistic, but are rather monistic. That means that all of reality is understood to be a totality, a whole. And within that whole is a law of causality about good and evil. And that law of causality is called karma, which means that good actions have good consequences and bad actions have bad consequences. But there's not an entity like a deity that's punishing or rewarding for bad acts, but rather that those consequences always come back and stick to the entity that did the bad act. Reincarnation is one way that that's talked about, that if you continue to move forward in right living and following the right path in life, being good to your family and doing the right thing, that you eventually you arrive at being born a human being, which is the pinnacle of that karmic cycle. But if you, as a human being, fail to be good or to do good, not to be good, but to do good, then you revert back and start over that cycle. So there's a sense that karmic causality is just inevitable. It's just part of the law of this vast universe. But because reality is one, you can have many deities, you can have many powers that embody various factors in life: creation, destruction, harmony, peace, fertility. All of these powerful forces in human life can be personified and have names. So it's not that you don't have some kind of theistic understanding in that monistic whole, but rather that all of that is contained in that whole. And so the job of a human being is to relate to all those powers, including the power of destruction and violence. So they're not ever overcome. They just exist as these powers that one has to learn to negotiate in order to live a good life. Buddhism is a subdivision. It's sort of like there's Judaism, and then the Christianity and Islam all relate to Judaism and to Jewish texts. And in Hinduism is the same. Buddhism comes out of Hindu culture. And so it shares that similar worldview of monism. But it's more of a, what I would say, missionizing religion than Hinduism has generally been. So it's spread all over East Asia rather rapidly, and I think the word in Buddhism for a moral injury is dukkha in Sanskrit, which means suffering. It's translated as suffering. But the literal translation is out of alignment. The metaphor is a wheel that's come out of its socket and can't move. Or maybe a better metaphor is when your shoulder is dislocated, your arm can't function, and there's intense pain at the site of the dislocation. And so dukkha is that kind of suffering, that your life is out of alignment with the good. And you are carrying the burdens of that out of alignment, that pain. And so you have to find the right life and spiritual practice that will alleviate that suffering. And so the point is to cease suffering in some way. And some traditions, like the Theravadan Buddhist tradition, have what was called a narrow path. It's a monastic path where you avoid all of the things that cause living a bad life: avarice, greed, lying, violence, those sort of things. And then you have Mahayana Buddhism, which is the largest group Buddhist, where you can do mindful practices. You can live a life that tries to avoid doing those things, but will alleviate, to work to alleviate the harm that's caused. So it's more lay oriented. It's not necessarily a monastic path. And then the third kind is Tibetan or Tantric Buddhism, where you go right into the suffering. It's called sitting in the fire. You face right into the evil, the violence, whatever, and you make your way through it to find the reality you need to find through that suffering. And so they're very different approaches. And then you have indigenous approaches that often use they tend to also be more holistic and see reality as a whole and have beings or powers that are inside that system. And they often then use collective approaches to healing. And that's actually true of Hinduism and Buddhism as well, that in Buddhism, you really are supposed to learn to meditate in a community with a leader, and that people generally, when they meditate in groups, not alone at home. But as it's been secularized, it's been turned into sort of individual self-care thing, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think the full benefit of it is really comes from being in community. I hope there's some more chat here, and we're really at the time to quit. So let's see what I can do here. Yes, this is a list of some of the sins in Islam. In the sense that there's only one God, which is what monotheism is about. Let's see, talking about the religious beliefs and the distinctions and how these impact our moral responses and injuries. Yes, I actually think that monotheism has a pretty sharp divide between good and evil, and generally the monotheistic God is good, and so evil has to be controlled or even defeated, or in some Christian groups eliminated by destruction of the current world and a new one made that's going to overcome evil somehow. And I think that creates more of a polarization between good and evil, and can be kind of rigid about what makes for good and what makes for evil. And I think monism can have that dimension to it, but is more often seen as you have to learn to relate to evil in a wise way rather than try to defeat it or turn away from it or avoid it. That in fact in Tibetan Buddhism is stepping right into it to get through it. And so that there's more of a what I would call willingness to tolerate ambiguity, willingness to not immediately react in a moralistic way when something goes wrong, but to say, well, I wonder what happened here. So I think that those meaning systems vary, and meaning systems also vary by individual. But these larger meaning systems also shape how people orient to the world. And it's true that in Western Christianity, especially, monotheism has resulted in a very strong focus on individuals and individual salvation. Whereas in monistic systems like Buddhism and in Asia, really the primary unit is your family or your community, and the individual is subordinated to the community because it's the community that's important. And so those approaches also create different responses to moral challenges, I think. And I think that the Western individual focus is especially difficult because moral injury is a relational problem. And so the person has to be able to retrust in relationship and feel confident in the relationships that they're in, that they're supported. And I think communities like refugee communities that come with that communitarian approach may be more resilient in the sense that people feel in an ongoing way more supported. And it's also important to handle moral injury, I think, in a team way, especially when people work in teams, because the teams need to be able to trust each other and work together. So I hope this was helpful to you. I think there are a couple of more of these that Conterra is sponsoring, but it's been a pleasure to be with you, and I really appreciate all the chat comments. And we will make the recording, once it's edited, we will make the recording available, and a PDF of my PowerPoint as well. Thank you very much.